The morning Garrett Foley got fired, he had left his 9-year-old son asleep on the couch with a blanket tucked under his chin and a half-eaten bowl of cereal on the coffee table. He had written a note, the same kind of note he wrote every time he had to leave before sunrise, and set it next to the bowl where the boy would find it. Back by noon. Pancakes. Love, Dad. He had done this so many times that the words came out without thinking. Muscle memory, like everything else in Garrett Foley's life. He had driven the 40 minutes to Meridian Structures in the dark. The kind of dark that only exists in the stretch between 4 and 5 a.m., when even the highway feels like it belongs to somebody else. The radio was off. He didn't need it. He already knew what he was going to do when he got there. The Herwick Tower project had been stalled for 11 days. 11 days was a long time in commercial construction. 11 days meant penalties. It meant the kind of phone calls that happened in glass-walled offices behind closed doors. The structural framing on the 14th floor had failed its load path calculations twice, and the firm's senior engineering team had run through 3 proposed solutions, each one rejected by the city inspector. Nobody could figure out why the numbers kept coming back wrong. Garrett Foley knew why. He was a site foreman. That was his title. That was what it said on his badge and on the single sheet of paper that constituted his employment record at Meridian Structures. Site foreman. He wore a hard hat and steel-toed boots and carried a radio clipped to his belt. And he spent his days walking the floors, checking schedules, managing crews. That was the job. That was all anyone at Meridian thought he did, what they didn't know. What he had never told anyone at this company, or the one before, or the one before that, was that Garrett Foley had spent 6 years as a licensed structural engineer at a firm in Portland before his wife got sick. Before everything changed, before he sold the house, moved back to Ohio to be near her family, took the first job he could find that paid weekly and asked no questions, and never quite climbed back to where he had been. He kept his license current because it cost $40 a year and seemed like the kind of thing a man ought to keep. But he never mentioned it. There was no point in mentioning it. That life was somewhere else. Behind a door he had closed quietly and hadn't tried to reopen. He took the elevator to 14. The floor was empty at that hour, framing exposed. The city still dark through the open skeleton of the building. He pulled up the load path diagrams on his tablet. He had requested access to the project files months ago for scheduling purposes, and nobody had ever thought to restrict what he could see. And he stood there in the cold for a long time, just looking. The error was in the transfer beam calculation. It wasn't complicated once you saw it. The original design had assumed a symmetric load distribution that didn't account for the lateral offset in the curtain wall attachment points. Every solution the engineering team had tried was trying to fix the wrong thing. They were patching the symptom. The problem was 20 feet to the left, buried in an assumption that had never been questioned. Garrett spent 2 hours with the drawings. Then he pulled up the calculation software on his tablet. His own license, his own login, not the firm's. And he ran the numbers himself. When he was done, he had a corrected load path model that would pass inspection. He knew it would pass because he had built structures like this before, and he understood in his bones what the numbers were saying. He flagged the relevant pages, wrote a clear explanation in the notes field, and submitted the corrected model to the project management system under his own name. Then he took the elevator back down, got in his truck, and drove home to make pancakes. He thought that was the end of it. Nadine Corso had been CEO of Meridian Structures for 14 months. She had come from the financial side of the industry, acquisitions, portfolio management, the kind of work that happened in boardrooms rather than on job sites. She was sharp, and she was organized, and she genuinely cared about the company her father had spent 30 years building, which was more than could be said for the private equity group that had almost bought it 2 years ago. She knew the business well enough to run it. She trusted her department heads to handle the details, which was why, when her director of engineering, a careful and territorial man named Stuart Bevins, came to her office on a Tuesday morning with a look on his face that she had learned to recognize as controlled outrage, she put down her coffee and gave him her full attention. "We have a problem," Stuart said. He placed a printed report on her desk. Someone submitted unauthorized revisions to the Herwick load path model last Thursday. Nadine looked at the report. Who? Garrett Foley, site foreman, 3rd year with the company. Stuart said the words with a particular flatness that communicated exactly what he thought of site foreman. He accessed the project files, ran calculations using external software, and submitted a corrected structural model, without authorization, without notifying the engineering team, without following any of the established protocols. Did the model work? Stewart paused. That pause told her everything. The city inspector has cleared the revision for construction. We can resume work on 14. So the problem is solved. The problem is solved. The problem, Stewart said, is liability. If that model had contained an error, if something had failed during or after construction based on revisions submitted by an unlicensed individual operating outside his scope of work, the company's exposure would have been catastrophic. We would have been looking at criminal negligence. Insurance wouldn't have touched it. He folded his hands on the desk. I've already spoken to legal. Their recommendation is termination, effective immediately, with documentation establishing that the action was unauthorized and that the company has zero tolerance for this kind of deviation. Nadine was quiet for a moment. Does he have an engineering background? His personnel file lists a high school diploma and 20 years of construction experience. No engineering degree. No certifications on record with us. She nodded slowly. Bring him in. Garrett came to her office that afternoon still in his work clothes. He sat across from her with his hard hat in his hands and his boots leaving faint marks on the carpet, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who had been through enough in his life that whatever was coming next was simply the next thing. Nadine told him what Stewart had told her. She was direct about it, because she had found that directness was almost always kinder than the alternative. She explained the liability issue. She explained the protocol violation. She told him that she respected the fact that he had solved the problem, and that the company genuinely appreciated it, but that she had an obligation to the safety framework that governed everything Meridian did, and that she couldn't allow what he had done to go unaddressed. Do you want to tell me why you did it? She asked. The calculation was wrong, Garrett said. I could see it was wrong. I knew how to fix it. You could have brought it to the engineering team. I did. 3 weeks ago, I submitted a note through the foreman's report system flagging the lateral offset issue. He said it without heat, without accusation, just the fact. It was marked, reviewed, and filed. Nadine made a note to pull that report after the meeting. Even so, she said, what you did was outside the boundaries of your role. Garrett looked at her. Not defensive, not angry, just clear-eyed, the way a man looks when he has already had the conversation with himself and arrived at a kind of peace about the outcome. I understand, he said. I have to let you go, she said. I'm sorry. He stood up, placed the hard hat on the edge of her desk, and held out his hand. She shook it, and then Garrett Foley walked out of the building, got in his truck, and drove to the school to pick up his son, because it was noon on a Tuesday and he had said he would be there. Nadine pulled the foreman's report that evening. The note was there, submitted 22 days ago, flagged as reviewed by Stuart Bevans's team. No follow-up action taken, no response logged. The lateral offset issue Garrett had identified was described clearly, in language that was, she slowed down when she noticed this, precise, not the language of a man who had learned construction from the ground up, the language of someone who understood the underlying engineering. She pulled his personnel file again. High school diploma. 20 years of construction. No certifications on record with us. That phrase caught her. On record with us? She asked HR to run a full background and credential check. It took until the following morning. Garrett Foley had a Bachelor of Science in Civil Engineering from Ohio State and a Master's in Structural Engineering from the University of Michigan. He had held a professional engineering license in Oregon from 2003 to 2011, when he had allowed it to lapse. He had renewed it in Ohio in 2014, and it had been current and in good standing ever since. He had been a licensed structural engineer for 12 years. He had spent 6 of those years at a firm in Portland. She looked up the firm, Foley & Associates, which turned out to be a firm he had founded, which had designed, among other things, 3 municipal buildings, 2 hospital expansion projects, and a bridge in Washington County that had won a state engineering award in 2010. Nadine sat in her office for a long time looking at this information. She thought about what it meant that a man with these qualifications had been working as a site foreman at her company for 3 years and no one had known. She thought about the 22-day-old report sitting unread in a filing system. She thought about Stuart Bevans's careful, territorial face. She thought about a corrected load path model that had cleared inspection in 48 hours after 11 days of failure. Then she thought about the fact that she had fired him yesterday afternoon. She picked up her phone and called the number in his personnel file. It rang 4 times. Then, yeah, a voice that sounded like it had been doing something physical when the phone rang. "Mr. Foley, this is Nadine Corso." A pause. "Ms. Corso, I owe you an apology," she said. "And I'd like to talk if you're willing." Another pause. Longer this time. In the background, she could hear what sounded like a kid's television program, something animated with a lot of sound effects. "When?" he said. "Tomorrow morning, if that works. I have to drop my son at school at 8:15. 9 o'clock, she said. "My office?" He came back in the same boots, same jacket. He looked around the office the same way he had the day before, taking in the room with a kind of quiet attention that she was only now recognizing as something other than passivity. She slid the credential report across the desk to him. He looked at it for a moment. His expression didn't change much, but something behind his eyes shifted, the way a door shifts when someone opens it from the other side. He set it back down on the desk. "You didn't mention any of this," she said. "No. Why not?" He thought about that for a moment, the way a man thinks when the real answer is complicated and he's deciding how much of it to say. "When I started here, I was in a bad place," he said. "My wife had died about 8 months earlier. My son was 5. I needed a job that was predictable and physical and didn't require me to be," he paused, looking for the word, "present in the way that running a firm requires you to be present. I wasn't capable of that yet." He looked at the window. And then 3 years went by, and it had been long enough that saying something felt strange. Like explaining why you've been quiet in a conversation for an hour? Nadine was quiet for a moment. The structural work on the Harwick project? That wasn't the first time you'd seen something you recognized? No. How often? He didn't answer right away. "Enough," he said. She thought about all the project notes in the foreman's report system, all the small, precise observations that she now understood in a different light. The phrasing that had seemed oddly technical for a site foreman. She thought about how many of those notes had been filed and forgotten. "I want to offer you your job back," she said. "A different job. We have a senior structural engineer position open. It's been open for 4 months. We haven't been able to fill it. I'd like you to consider it." He looked at her. "What about Stewart?" She had spent the previous afternoon in a 2-hour conversation with the board's legal counsel and another 2 hours with HR. "Stewart is being reassigned to a role with less direct project authority," she said, which was the careful way of saying that Stewart had been given a choice between a demotion and a resignation, and had chosen a demotion after his attorney reviewed his contract. "That's not your concern to manage. It's mine." Garrett was quiet for a moment. He had a way of being quiet that didn't feel empty. It felt considered. "The Harwick project," he said. "If I come back, I want to walk the 14th floor with the engineering team before we resume framing. There are 2 other issues in the calculations I didn't have time to address." Nadine blinked. 2 other issues. Minor ones. But worth addressing before the pour. She looked at him for a moment. Then she almost laughed, though she stopped herself because it didn't seem like the right moment. "Yes," she said. "Of course." His son's name was Patrick, and he was 9 years old, and thought it was mildly interesting that his father had gotten fired and unhired in the same week. Patrick was at the age where the dramatic things adults did seemed mostly logistical, and he was more focused on whether the return to employment would affect the planned Saturday trip to the Science Museum, which it would not. Garrett had told him that evening at dinner. Just the 2 of them, like always, at the small table in the kitchen with the overhead light that flickered sometimes when the furnace kicked on. He had explained it in simple terms, that he had fixed something at work that needed fixing, and the people in charge hadn't liked the way he had done it. And then they had looked more carefully at who he was and changed their minds. Patrick had listened with the focused, slightly skeptical attention of a 9-year-old who had learned to take information at face value and evaluate it later. "So, they fired you and then unfired you?" "More or less." "Because you're actually an engineer?" "I've always been an engineer. I just hadn't told them." Patrick thought about this, turning it over in the way that kids do when something doesn't quite fit the categories they've been given. "Why didn't you tell them?" Garrett looked at his son for a moment. The flickering light, the furnace sound, the familiar smallness of the kitchen that had been their whole world for 3 years now. "I wasn't ready yet," he said, "but I think I am now." Patrick nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned to his food. "Can we still go Saturday?" "Yes," Garrett said. "We can still go Saturday." The Harwick Tower project resumed framing on a Wednesday. Garrett walked the 14th floor that morning with a team of 3 engineers who had initially looked at him the way people look at someone who has been introduced as more important than they expected. By the end of the 2-hour walkthrough, the looking had stopped. The 2 additional calculation issues he had flagged were real, one of them significant enough that the project manager, a brisk woman named Terry who had been in construction for 25 years, told him quietly that finding it before the pour had probably saved the company a 6-figure remediation. "How did you see it?" she asked. "I poured enough concrete to know what the numbers feel like when something's off," he said. She looked at him for a moment and then laughed, short and genuine. "Fair enough." He started in the new role the following Monday. His title was Senior Structural Engineer. The salary was more than he had made in Portland, which surprised him, and then didn't, because 14 months of construction costs had changed a great many numbers in the industry. He updated his profile in the company system on the first day, uploading his credentials and his license information and a list of past projects that made the HR coordinator pause and look up from her screen with an expression he recognized but had forgotten he could produce in people. He did not go back to the site foreman role, but he spent the first 3 weeks walking every active project in the portfolio anyway, because he had been on those sites and he knew things that weren't in any file. He submitted reports. He had conversations. He asked questions that turned out more than once to have answers that changed the direction of a project. Stuart Bevins passed him in the hallway once, about a month after Garrett returned. Stuart's new title was Director of Compliance Review, which was a real job, but a quieter one, without the department, without the authority to sign off on field decisions. He nodded at Garrett. Garrett nodded back. Neither of them said anything, and that was fine. Some things didn't require words. There is a particular kind of man who can carry a large thing quietly for a long time, not because he lacks ambition, or because he doesn't know his own worth, but because there are seasons in a life when carrying quietly is the most that can be asked of you, and the man who understands this doesn't waste energy resenting it. He does what needs doing. He makes the pancakes. He tucks in the note. He watches the calculation error that 11 days of expert attention has missed, and he fixes it, and he drives home, because his son is asleep, and his son needs a father who shows up. The recognition, when it finally comes, is not a vindication. It doesn't feel like a door swinging open with dramatic light behind it. It feels quieter than that. It feels like the moment when you realize that the season has changed, and the heavy thing you have been carrying is still there, but the weight of it has shifted, and for the first time in a long while, it is manageable. Garrett Foley drove to the Science Museum that Saturday. Patrick ran ahead on the sidewalk the way 9-year-olds do, too impatient for adult pacing, already pointing at something through the glass doors before his father had finished parking the car. Garrett watched him and felt the particular fullness that has no name. Not happiness exactly, not pride exactly, but something underneath both of those things, something load-bearing. He locked the truck and caught up with his son.